Picture the map. Right now, at this exact moment, two of the most powerful warships ever built are converging on a body of water roughly the size of California. The USS Abraham Lincoln is already there, sitting in the Persian Gulf like a loaded gun on a table, and the USS Gerald R. Ford, fresh off combat operations in Venezuela, is steaming in from the Caribbean to join it. When those two ships are in the same theater, the United States will have more concentrated air power in one region than it has assembled since the opening night of Iraqi freedom. That's not a coincidence. That's a message. And Iran's regime has about 72 hours to decide whether it's going to read it. Let's start with what makes the USS Gerald R. Ford's arrival different from just parking another carrier in the Gulf. Most carrier deployments are a show of force, a reminder that America can project power. This one is different because this crew has already used that power. Recently, 6 weeks ago, aircraft operating from this exact flight deck participated in America's shock and awe raid on Venezuela, the operation that ended with Nicolas Maduro in handcuffs, and a regime that had defied Washington for 2 decades collapsing in under 48 hours. The pilots flying off the Ford's deck didn't just train for that, they did it. They know what the first 30 minutes of a coordinated strike looks like from the cockpit, not the classroom. That matters more than any hardware specification. Combat experience is the one thing you can't manufacture in a simulator. As for the hardware, the Ford brings a specific and deliberate mix of aircraft. No F-35s. Those are already on the Abraham Lincoln, and there are enough of them. What the Ford brings are F/A-18 Super Hornets and EA-18G Growlers. Think of it as the difference between a scalpel and a hammer. The Lincoln's F-35s are the scalpel, invisible, precise, built to penetrate layered air defenses that would swat down older jets. The Ford's F-18S are the hammer, high-volume strike aircraft that can cycle off the deck again and again once those air defenses have been peeled back. Together, the two carriers can generate 33% more sorties than either one alone. In military math, that's not a 33% increase in firepower. It's the difference between a campaign that runs out of steam and one that doesn't. Why two carriers? Why now? The honest answer is that the United States has been watching Iran's behavior during nuclear negotiations and not liking what it sees. On paper, the US and Iran are in talks. Iran's regime has been at the table. Words have been exchanged. But while those words were being spoken, Iran's ballistic missile production lines never slowed down. Satellite imagery reviewed by the New York Times shows that missile facilities damaged during Operation Midnight Hammer in 2025, the B-2 strike campaign that temporarily set Iran's nuclear program back, have been rapidly rebuilt. The reconstruction happened fast, suspiciously fast. Certain facilities prioritized over others in a pattern that tells U.S. intelligence analysts exactly what Iran considers most valuable to protect. That's not the behavior of a government that's seriously considering giving up its nuclear ambitions. There's a second reason the Ford is heading east, and it's uglier. Iran's regime has been killing its own people at a scale that's only now becoming clear. When protests erupted in late 2025, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, Iran's ideological enforcement army, cracked down with lethal force. Initial estimates put the death toll in the thousands. Newly reviewed documents obtained by Iran International now suggest that figure was off by an order of magnitude. More than 36,500 Iranians were killed in the crackdown's first phase alone. Trump had explicitly warned Iran against executing protesters. Iran's regime did. It anyway, on a scale 15 times larger than anyone initially reported. In diplomatic terms, that's not just defiance, that's a dare. Here's where the script usually writes itself. The US is the unstoppable force, Iran is the immovable object, and we fast forward to the explosion. But that framing misses something important. Iran has been preparing for exactly this scenario for 30 years. Not with conventional warships. Iran has no carrier, no blue water navy that could last an afternoon against a U.S. strike group. But Iran's military doctrine was never built around matching the United States ship for ship, jet for jet. It was built around making the cost of a fight unacceptably high. The strategy has a name: asymmetric warfare. And in the Persian Gulf, Iran has specific tools to execute it. First, drones. Iran manufactures Shahed attack drones in significant numbers. The same design that Russia has been using against Ukraine and which Ukraine's air defenses have found consistently difficult to intercept at scale. Iran doesn't need its drones to be accurate. It needs them to be numerous. A swarm of 200 drones aimed at a carrier group doesn't have to hit the carrier. It just has to exhaust the carrier's defenses, burning through expensive interceptor missiles at a rate of one per cheap drone. A $50,000 interceptor for a $20,000 drone. Repeat until something gets through. Second, the geography. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow choke point connecting the Persian Gulf to the wider world, is only 21 miles wide at its tightest point. Iran sits on one side of it. Fast attack boats, anti-ship missiles, and naval mines are all part of Iran's doctrine for that strait. A U.S. carrier is 1,100 feet long. The Strait of Hormuz at its narrowest is roughly 110,000 feet across. The math isn't comfortable. Third, proxies. The Houthis in Yemen, militia groups in Iraq, Hezbollah in Lebanon. Iran doesn't need to fire every missile itself. It has partners, distributed across the region, who can force the U.S. to play defense in multiple directions simultaneously. This is why two carriers matter. One carrier faces a genuine problem if Iran commits to a full asymmetric campaign. You simply can't defend 360 degrees with one strike group's worth of escorts. Two carriers force Iran to split its resources, and a military force to split its resources against a superior opponent typically ends up being effective at nothing. Reuters reported on February 13th, citing two U.S. officials, that any strike on Iran would not resemble Operation Midnight Hammer. That was a surgical operation. Specific targets, specific weapons, in and out before Iran could fully process what had happened. What's being planned now is categorically different. The officials described a multi-week campaign targeting not just Iran's nuclear infrastructure, but its security apparatus, military command structures, and state facilities. In plain terms, the U.S. isn't planning to set Iran's nuclear program back 5 years. It's planning to dismantle the machinery that runs Iran's regime. The opening act would look familiar to anyone who studied the first night of Iraqi freedom. The Lincoln's F-35s go in first, invisible to Iranian radar, mapping and then dismantling Iran's layered air defense network. The S-300 batteries purchased from Russia, the radar installations, the command nodes that coordinate the defense. This is the part where the Growlers earn their budget. EA-18G electronic warfare aircraft pump out jamming power across multiple frequency bands simultaneously, flooding Iranian radar screens with ghost signals and false returns until operators can't distinguish a real threat from digital noise. Once the corridors are open, the Ford's F-18S follow. Higher volume, less stealthy, but operating in airspace that the F-35s have already sanitized. Tomahawk cruise missiles, launched from the destroyers and cruisers escorting both carriers, come in at low altitude from unexpected vectors, hitting fixed targets with the precision of a guided missile that's been in service for 40 years and gets smarter with every software update. The E-2D Hawkeye airborne radar aircraft, essentially flying command and control stations with the most advanced airborne radar on the planet, coordinate the whole symphony from altitude, feeding targeting data to aircraft and ships simultaneously, while also watching Iran's swarm response develop in real time. Against one carrier, Iran's drone saturation strategy has a chance. Against two carriers with Hawkeyes overhead and Growlers jamming everything that flies, it becomes a very expensive way to lose drones. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said it plainly in an Al Jazeera interview. If the U.S. strikes, Iran will hit U.S. bases across the region. He named them Qatar, Bahrain, Jordan. The statement was meant to sound like a deterrent. It functions more like an admission, because here's the problem with that threat. Every ballistic missile Iran fires at a U.S. base in Qatar is a missile not flying at a carrier. Every drone diverted to Bahrain is a drone not contributing to the saturation campaign in the Gulf. Iran has real firepower, but it isn't infinite. The moment it starts spending that firepower in multiple directions, the U.S. gains the ability to absorb the distributed attacks while concentrating its own strikes. And Iran knows this, which is perhaps why, buried beneath all the defiant rhetoric about death to America, The IRGC recently staged a video of its forces chanting that exact phrase from the deck of a converted container ship, which is either a serious show of force or the most elaborate way to demonstrate that Iran's navy consists of a repurposed cargo vessel. There are quieter signals emerging. On February 15th, Iran's deputy foreign minister told the BBC that the ball is in America's court. In diplomatic language, that's the sound of someone looking for a ladder to climb down. The question is whether the U.S. will offer one before the Geneva talks on February 17th produce something definitive. Trump's position has been consistent: make a deal or face consequences. The Ford's arrival transforms that from a rhetorical threat into a geographic fact. Here's what's actually remarkable about this moment. The United States has assembled in one relatively small body of water enough air power to fundamentally alter the political landscape of the Middle East. Not temporarily, not symbolically, permanently. The last time America did something like this to a government, a rapid, overwhelming campaign designed to remove a regime's ability to function, it took 21 days. Venezuela took 48 hours. Iran is a harder problem. Its military is larger, its geography more complex, its alliances more distributed. But the gap between what Iran can absorb and what two carrier strike groups can deliver has never been wider. Iran's regime built its survival strategy around the assumption that America would never commit to a full campaign. Every decision Khamenei has made, the nuclear program, the proxy network, the missile buildup, was calculated against a version of America that would bluster, sanction, and ultimately look away. Two carriers in the Persian Gulf is the evidence that the calculation may have been wrong. Whether the Geneva talks change anything depends entirely on whether Iran's regime has decided that survival looks more like a deal than a fight. Given that they've already rebuilt what we bombed once, that's not a question with an obvious answer. But the Ford is almost there, and once it arrives, the answer will have to come.